It's time for our weekly feature where we look at stories dominating the headlines in the past few days. The Madlanga Commission, an ad hoc committee inquiry probing allegations of misconduct in the South African Police Service, heard testimony from KwaZulu-Natal Hawks head Major General Lesetja Senona, who now claims to be kicked out of his office. KZN police have since moved to set the record straight, saying he breached security protocol. For more on this story and others, we're joined by Newzroom Afrika's Zoleka Qodashe, criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal, political analyst Sandile Swana, as well as international relations expert Professor André Thomashausen. Good to have you all on the program this evening. Zoleka, I'll start with you, maybe highlighting the story we kicked off with regarding Senona and the troubles he's faced getting into the office today. What's the update there?
Well, we remember, Nhlanhla, that essentially this is not testimony that has been new in relation to Senona. You remember that when there was testimony before the ad hoc committee in relation to the convicted criminal Vusimuzi Madlala, he had said that there was a meeting in KwaZulu-Natal in which Nhlanhla was present, and it was Senona that he was close acquaintances with and actually had a close relationship with and would assist him in meeting Nhlanhla. He said that the purpose of that particular gathering was to ensure that he secured the 360 million rand tender in the Tshwane district. And you remember that there's been a variety of allegations surrounding that particular tender and how Vusimuzi Madlala actually managed to secure that particular tender. And that has been something that has now been thrust to the fore yet again before the Commission of Inquiry that's investigating these allegations of criminal infiltration and political interference in the criminal justice system. So what we saw unfold last week really was that close relationship between the convicted criminal as well as a senior member of the police service, because you'll remember that Vusimuzi Madlala told the ad hoc committee when they descended upon Kgoshi Mampuru Correctional Facility in November or December 2025 that essentially the purpose of Senona being there was to ensure that he facilitated this particular meeting between Vusimuzi Madlala as well as Nhlanhla, the top cop in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, who would ensure that he then spoke to the person in charge of HR that would ensure that he did not have any further challenges surrounding that controversial tender. So that's testimony that has come out to the fore yet again before the inquisitorial body in Pretoria and Nhlanhla.
Yeah, we go back to finding out what's happening at the ad hoc inquiry a bit later in this conversation. But as all of this is happening, let me go to you, Mr. Swana. South Africa has expelled South Africa's, or rather Israel's chargé d'affaires, citing repeated insults to President Cyril Ramaphosa and breaches of a diplomatic protocol. Maybe let's speak to this matter. What does this moment tell us about how assertive South Africa wants to be, especially on the global stage?
Oh, thank you so much, and good evening to your viewers. South Africa has profiled itself with respectable success as a voice of the global South. And they've been very assertive, and they've received support. The government has received support from the EU as a voice of the global South. Recently, they've been awarded an opportunity to host the World Economic Forum here. Recently, they successfully hosted the G20. So South Africa is not only assertive, but is gaining support, fortunately for South Africa, at a time where the hegemony of the NATO and the USA is actually fragile. Yeah.
Professor Thomashausen, under the Vienna Convention, for instance, a host country has the right to declare a person or diplomat a persona non grata. But in practical terms, how serious is this step in international diplomacy?
Yes, it is the most severe sanction that you send a diplomat away. It is one step before the severing of all diplomatic relations, the closing of the missions. And that, of course, goes to the grain of diplomacy, because diplomacy is all about talking, about exchanging views and discussing differences rather than going to war against each other. So it is a drastic step. I find the motivation given in the communique by Dirko very, very flimsy. So the ambassador went to see King Dalindyebo, who felt that he needs to help his people because they had no access to drinkable water, and they had no functioning schools, and they had no access to health, to a hospital that would function. I don't think he needed the permission of Dirko for that. There's nothing in the South African law or in the Vienna Convention that would have obliged him to do this. King Dalindyebo, as a traditional leader, should probably have informed the provincial government that he intends to have these contacts. But then again, I don't see anything in the Constitution that would have forced him to do that. So one has taken an incident and escalated it to quite a dramatic level, which of course comes with consequences.
It does come with consequences, and maybe let's turn that to you, Professor Gopal. When people see governments openly accusing diplomats of abusing privilege, how does that shape public understanding of power and accountability in the country?
Yeah, well, good evening, Nhlanhla, and the viewers as well as my fellow panelists. Yeah, I think, you know, unfortunately, I think for us, the majority of our electorate is not as analytical and critical as we'd like them to be. But I think for those who are, it definitely shows us that there could have been an abuse of power in as far as the, you know, the presidency or the executive of the country is concerned. So I think that, you know, for those who understand it, that's what it actually signifies.
Yeah. Zoleka, from a reportage point of view, government says this decision followed several warnings and diplomatic rebukes as well. From what you've observed, was this expulsion inevitable, or could it still have been avoided at this point?
Well, I think, Nhlanhla, that the relations between South Africa as well as Israel have been frosty for quite a while. You remember that it was South Africa that championed that particular application before the World Court, that is the International Court of Justice, essentially decrying the genocidal intent that was being pursued by Israel in Palestine. And so those particular relations haven't been the best since then, and it has been continuous, because in relation to South Africa as well as Israel, South Africa has been at the forefront of condemning a lot of Israel's actions in Palestine. And so that is something that I think has been inevitable. But I think in relation to multilateralism as well as its relationship with the United States, you'll remember that Israel is a close ally of the United States. So I do think that this particular move may have implications in relation to South Africa's stance or relationship with the United States, given those frosty relations. And when we look at the relationship that South Africa has had with with the United States, and the tensions that we've seen unfold, a lot of people have singled it down to that particular application before the World Court. So I do think that those frosty relations are something that essentially have boiled over, and it has been inevitable that we find ourselves in the place that we are at the moment.
Yeah. Mr. Swana, this dispute unfolds against the backdrop of South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ. How much of this expulsion is about legal principle in your view? And how much is it about political messaging?
I think it is about political messaging and also security, national security. You must remember that when you look at nations like Israel and the USA, Mossad and the CIA, you look at what they've done in the Middle East and elsewhere, they look for all these royals and the elites who are corrupt and build a relationship with those corrupt elites at a distance from the population. So they are now looking for these royals such as Dalindyebo in South Africa to create internal divisions. You will remember that our diplomacy with the United States is based on lies, that Trump even put a false video, when Ramaphosa and company were in his office. So it's a disinformation creating divisions. So South Africa had to take the step for its own internal security. And actually, this step needs to be followed with the closure of this embassy, because people like Mossad, CIA, and so on can use this embassy to spy on the country and to destabilize the country. So this statement sends a clear message that this agent and representative of the United States of America, being Israel, can be touched, and it has been touched, and South Africa will continue to press in against the imperialists of the West, more particularly.
We continue our discussion in a short while, unpacking some of the stories leading, or rather the week's leading news stories this week. We are joined by Newzroom Africa's Zoleka, Qodashe, criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal, as well as political analyst Sandile Swana and international relations expert Professor André Thomashausen. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We continue unpacking some of the week's leading stories and speaking to a panel of experts this evening. We have Zoleka, Qodashe, who's a Newzroom Afrika reporter, criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal, political analyst Sandile Swana, as well as international relations expert Professor André Thomashausen. Professor Gopal, I'll go back to a story I highlighted when we began our chat regarding Senona raising a complaint that he was kicked out of Hawks offices this morning or today. Maybe let's get more about your reaction to the story. From a criminology perspective, what does the removal of a senior Hawks official from his office and the confiscation of his gadgets, what does this suggest about the seriousness of the investigation?
Yeah, I think, as you rightfully say, it does suggest that his allegations are extremely serious, especially the fact that he has been sharing confidential information with Vusimusi Matlala. But I think in addition to that, you know, the seriousness, I think what it's also signifying or signaling to the broader South African community is that the president himself is taking this quite seriously, but we also know that it was top cop General Qodashe who actually ordered that he be suspended. But I think he's also been given an opportunity to you know, to present his point of view. But I think at this point in time, it does signal that South Africa seems to be serious, and regardless of the fact that he is, you know, he was heading the KZN Hawks, his behavior was definitely unethical and unprofessional.
Yeah, but could Senona's conduct, as described at the commission, could it potentially undermine ongoing or future prosecutions as well, from what we're reading?
If you're talking about future prosecutions in terms of what has been generated from the Madlanga Commission,
yeah,
I don't necessarily think so. Future prosecution in terms of his role as the KZN head of Hawks, I don't necessarily believe so, because I think that all of this should have been and would have been considered prior to the decision to suspend him.
Mm. And Mr. Swana, maybe let me take this question to you then. How common is it for senior law enforcement figures to even remain employed while being investigated? And what risk does this pose for you?
Thank you, Zanda. Remaining employed is not really the problem. What you don't want a person to do is to be able to interfere with witnesses, interfere with records that could be used in the case against them. There are a number of cases against senior police officers, magistrates, and so on. There are a number of cases in progress as we speak, disciplinary cases, others in the courts. So there are a number of these cases. But the only thing we must say is that every person who's suspected of wrongdoing witnesses must be protected, evidence must be protected, and the rights of the person must be protected.
Yeah. Professor Thomashausen, maybe let's go back to the issue around South Africa expelling Israel's diplomat here in the country. Let's speak more about this. Could this diplomatic clash that we are seeing play out here, could it complicate South Africa's relationship with powerful allies who are critical, especially of the ICJ case?
Yes, surely. We seem to be forgetting conveniently that the main players within the BRICS differ from South Africa substantially on the Gaza conflict. The UAE, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, India, they have absolutely no sympathy with Hamas, with the Hamas-governed territory. They support Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the actual legal government of Palestine. They interact with him. They support his plea to disarm Hamas and that his government should take over the law and order function in Gaza and negotiate with powers that are willing to make available funding, the reconstruction of Gaza. So South Africa is a little bit alone here, and I disagree that South Africa represents the global South on this, on its hostility, its one could say aggressive hostility against Israel. The EU has declared the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization, and they consider Hamas a terrorist organization for a long time. So what South Africa is doing is the opposite of an effective, silent diplomacy. They seem to have, Minister Lamola seems to have forgotten the value of diplomacy, of communications that are not immediately in the public eye. And we risk more sanctions. We risk more disadvantages for South Africans. We're also forgetting that in South Africa, we have about 4 million children under 5 years that are deprived of protein. It's malnutrition, chronic malnutrition. It leads to a terrible developmental condition called stunting. If the apartheid government had deprived 5 million African children of protein, there would have been, quite rightly so, a worldwide outcry. So bias towards a conflict that is not even a conflict on the African continent. I miss any kind of statement from Dirko about the conflict in Sudan that has cost over 2 million lives. Where's our commitment to human rights and peace in the case of Sudan? So there will be a Lesetja very soon in the Government of National Unity to discuss our foreign policy. And why are we insisting on making enemies of our main trading partners?
Yeah. Zoleka, judging by what we've heard just now, there's also been developments where Israel has responded by expelling South Africa's senior representative. Maybe let's speak to this issue. What does this tit-for-tat reaction suggest about where this relationship is headed?
Well, Nhlanhla, you'll also remember that it was in 2023 when the National Assembly actually heard a motion for South Africa to expel any diplomats, Israeli diplomats in South Africa. So I think it's been a long time coming in terms of South Africa's stance. And that particular motion was brought by the economic freedom fighters. So it has been a long time coming in terms of South Africa's stance. But in relation to Israel and its attitude towards the United States, I mean, there's been several instances where there have been several instances where Israel has also adopted a similar attitude in relation to South Africa. You'll remember that particularly at the International Court of Justice, it was Israel's argument that South Africa had misinterpreted the law and that, in fact, there was no dispute between itself as well as South Africa. And so it has been a long time coming in relation to those particular relations, and it does point to frosty relations between the two states.
Yeah. Mr. Swana, some are arguing that South Africa has long supported the Palestinian cause, for instance. Does this decision then reinforce moral consistency, or does it risk diplomatic isolation?
South Africa has a well-documented and published national interest document. Is there, it's available. And that document goes back to our history, which is also well documented, that for us to win the battles that we've won, were supported by internationalist forces, were anti-imperialism, anti-colonialist, and anti-apartheid. And we have been in alliance with the people of Palestine as the people, the vast, overwhelming majority, two-thirds majority in parliament today. We have been in majority, in solidarity with Palestine, unambiguously so, with the people of Palestine. Now, that is not simply being in solidarity with Hamas. That is not the issue. We are in solidarity with all the people of Palestine and the two-state solution in Palestine under the United Nations. So South Africa is not inconsistent. The direction that the present government and the two-thirds majority in parliament is taking is consistent with Nelson Mandela's articulation on all global platforms. It is well known, it has not been done in secret, and there is a need for Dirko to press ahead and close that embassy of Israel and drive the point home.
Yeah. Professor Gopal, as we continue observing happenings at the Madlanga Commission and also expectations of more evidence or testimony that's expected from these hearings, I'm very interested in going back to evidence we've heard about this cozy relationship that we heard about Senona and attempted murder accused, that's Vusimuzi Kat Matlala. And in that testimony, we also saw WhatsApp messages that also reveal the nature of their relationship as well. Let's speak to this. What is the evidence presented at the Commission, such as these WhatsApp messages that I mentioned? What does it reveal about Senona's relationship with this tenderpreneur or businessman, Vusimuzi Kat Matlala?
Of course, I think, you know, the coziness or the comfort, the level of comfort that he had with Vusimuzi Kat Matlala speaks volumes about the, you know, of course, the kind of relationship. But I think in Nhlanhla, what's more concerning is the fact that as a law enforcement officer, he actually had this very personal and cozy relationship with someone who's number one, probably in terms of the the Big Five. And that doesn't augur well for a law enforcement officer because as we saw and as we heard through the various WhatsApp messages, etc., that he was key in releasing very confidential information, not just in terms of the tenders that he was hoping that he could be the middle person in, but also the personal information of other officers within his space. So I think long term, what it does, it undermines, of course, the integrity of the South African police services, and unfortunately it's people like Senona who has brought the SAPS into disrepute and has, I think, further eroded the confidence of South Africans. So definitely this kind of cozy relationship, although we know that he was trying to defend himself and say that he, when he was probed on the relationship between, whether he knew about the relationship between his son and Vusimusikat Matlala, to some extent, he blankly denied it, and he was further probed. But of course, all the time we knew that he was trying to absolve himself from having any idea, or really from his point of view, a relationship. Although at the beginning he said that they were close friends and they called each other brother, etc. But, as the questioning continued and the probing continued, you could hear the contradictions come through. So certainly the kind of relationship that nobody wants for a law enforcement officer.
Mr. Swana, I see you chuckling as well as this bromance is being described in front of us. But how might this case then impact the broader credibility of the Hawks and anti-corruption initiatives in this country, of course, as we watch these proceedings unfold?
Well, the proceedings at the Madlanga Commission and in the ad hoc committee, we knew before they started that they would damage the reputation of the government as a whole and the security cluster in its entirety, as well as the police. So there is no question about that. However, I suppose the most interesting question is whether people such as Firoz Khan and others have got a recovery strategy to really build a proper police force in South Africa, which we do not have at the moment.
Zoleka, I'll give you the last bite here, and still looking at these parallel hearings, what should the public be watching out for, especially next as we watch these proceedings unfold? What's it to take place?
So before the ad hoc committee, we're expected to continue hearing public submissions next week. But I think at the heart of it, what South Africans should look at is what is really at stake. And as witnesses appear before the ad hoc committee as well as the Commission of Inquiry, what you see is that there is clearly a fracture, or there are fractures within the criminal justice system, particularly within the SAPS. So you have one faction sort of fighting against the other. And I think the question to ask is why that is happening, right? And the testimony that we've heard is that essentially this is about the Secret Service account of crime intelligence, as well as having power over that slush fund. I mean, just last week, we heard about how these particular funds were going to be used out of a budget of 109 million rand. 45 million rand was to be used for a grabber at a conference of the ANC in 2017. That is what we heard from the former financial services head at Crime Intelligence, and how he was ejected from the system because he alleges that he was trying to safeguard the purse of Crime Intelligence. So what you have is this fight over what really seems to be procurement matters within the SAPS. And that is really what I think South Africans need to look at when we look at what is really causing the fractures and the divisions that we see within the SAPS. And I think also, Nhlanhla, the fact that we see the fractures play out for all to see in the manner in which we do speaks to the role of these particular parallel systems that are tasked with investigating the veracity of these claims of criminal infiltration and political interference in the criminal justice system. And what everyone should be asking themselves, because you remember that this particular process is not one that has an evidentiary threshold, because it is unlike a criminal court where there is where a court would find that someone is guilty and as opposed to the balance of probabilities, right? Where a court looks at whether the reasonable person would come to the same conclusion as that of Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, whether there is this link between Vusimuzi Matlala, for example, as well as KT Molefe, and whether there is a cartel that really exists. Because what we've seen before these particular inquisitorial bodies is that the testimony that has been presented is that there are several instances in which Vusimuzi Matlala communicates rather with Brown Mokgotsi, and KT Molefe also has senior police officers that are within his inner circle. But whether those testimonies have drawn the link between Vusimuzi Matlala, for example, as well as KT Molefe, so that everyone can deduce that there is a cartel that exists, I think is something that both the Commission of Inquiry as well as the ad hoc committee will be looking at as it continues testing whether looking at the veracity of the claims that have been made by Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi.
Let me thank you all for your time. Of course, as we unpacked some of this week's leading stories, that's Newzroom Afrika's Zoleka Qodashe. We also had criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal, political analyst Sandile Swana, and international relations expert Professor André Thomashausen, also giving us his perspective about news making headlines this week. We bring you more updates in the 12 hours. Do stay with us.